This is Happy Inc., written by Craig A. Falconer, narrated by Megan Carter. Chapter 1. When Gillian Reid turned the final corner towards her designated parking spot outside Happy Inc.'s developmental HQ, she had no idea that the unusual weekend she had just completed was set to give way to a positively unprecedented Monday. After blitzing her way through all of the extra analytics work she'd been assigned with most of Saturday to spare, Gillian spent Sunday brainstorming ways to ensure that her company's latest product would meet its potential. It was without doubt the most productive weekend of Gillian's life, despite the 2 unusually indulgent 7-hour sleeps that had punctuated her working hours. Although pride never raised its head for more than a few seconds, Gillian knew that her work was important. No work was more important, in fact, and she was sure her bosses would be delighted with the ideas she was about to bring their way. For the full 6 years since Gillian was recruited out of college, Happy Inc. had been promising a shift towards a more seamless method of minimizing harmful emotional volatility. Playing an integral part in the testing process now put her in a rare position of knowing what the future of the company, and thus the future of society, might entail. All of the early signs were good, and Gillian's weekend breakthroughs made those good signs even clearer. While waiting for the automated barrier to rise so she could reach her parking spot, Gillian's attention suddenly turned to a ruckus on the other side of the street. She squinted and raised a hand to block out the rising sunlight. "Poor guy," she sighed, catching sight of the UTS sufferer who was remonstrating with police officers about something or another. Just as she rolled down her window, the shabbily dressed man began to yell in a manner that made Gillian physically cringe. Being unaccustomed to such sounds, they hit her like nails on a chalkboard. Fortunately, Gillian's clover kicked in with a timely and relaxing pulse which protected her from the kind of low mood the man was evidently experiencing. The scourge of unrestrained temperamentality syndrome, which once affected every human on the planet, was a scourge Gillian was thankful to have been born late enough to avoid. From the moment the relaxing pulse arrived, and barely a few seconds after catching sight of the man, Gillian now listened to his increasingly loud complaints with complete indifference. Even as his volume rose and rose, she noticed it less and less. There was no longer any sense of sympathy within Gillian for the man's condition, and no longer any personal discomfort at his ear-piercing hollering. Happy Inc.'s world-changing clover, the contiguous limiter of volatile emotion, had once again done its job. Chapter 2. The main entrance door opened automatically as Gillian approached, its inset happy cam recognizing her face as that of not just an authorized employee, but one of the company's brightest young workers. "Good morning, Gillian," a monotonous voice greeted her through an unseen speaker. "You look perfectly content today." "I am perfectly content every day," she replied without emotion. Gillian continued to the building's glass elevator and pressed the button for her 5th-floor office. Once inside the elevator, she couldn't help but gaze indifferently at the shabbily dressed man across the street, who now looked like he was resisting arrest for the public nuisance he had caused. It was spectacularly rare to see even a single case of unrestrained temperamentality syndrome in public, given the total market penetration of Happy Inc.'s services, so Gillian's curiosity kept her looking the man's way even after the elevator doors reopened on her floor. If this curiosity had been accompanied by anything more heightened, like the sympathy she had felt a few minutes ago, Gillian's clover would have kicked in to distract her. But her brain was primarily thinking rather than feeling, so no intervention was yet deemed necessary. When looking down at the man, Gillian reflected again on how rare it was to see someone like him. She hadn't seen a single temperamental since the leaves were green. Rumors always circled of isolated groups who foolishly resisted Happy Inc.'s mission to rid the world of emotional volatility, but Gillian didn't believe it. In her experience, temperamentals were easy to spot, always smiling or frowning, flashing their lack of emotional control like it was something to be proud of. While her own clover didn't allow her to feel sorry for anyone, Since sorrow and sympathy were negative emotions it was programmed to protect her from, Gillian was never inclined to feel anything negative towards such individuals. Unrestrained temperamentality syndrome sufferers truly were sufferers, who simply didn't know the comfort that a clover flash would provide them, let alone the seamless comfort of a new clover dot of the kind Gillian had been trialing for the past week. Before Gillian was even born, and long before Happy Inc. became the world's largest corporation, a brilliant team of neurologists changed the world with an invention designed to reduce people's levels of what they termed emotional volatility. At first, advertisements encouraged consumers to flash your blues away with Happy Inc. The flash referenced a process that could be crudely understood as an instantaneous neurological hypnotism. This involved a subliminally information-rich flash of light being delivered to consumers at monthly intervals to make and keep their brains susceptible to the effects of carefully chosen radio pulses. When an individual was deemed to be veering towards an overly volatile or heightened emotional state, an appropriate radio pulse could then be directed to them to ensure they remained in a stable emotional position. At first, the flashes and pulses provided an emotional floor of sorts, ensuring no consumer would fall into despair or depression. For good reason, this was heralded as a major medical breakthrough, but the company did not stop there. From a relatively modest starting point, Happy Inc.'s programmers and neurologists began to raise their paying customers' emotional floors to ensure that they weren't just not sad, but were instead truly happy. For the first time in human history, anyone who was anyone truly could buy happiness. Inevitable calls of unfairness swirled around the cost of the service, and before long, Happy Inc. accepted a deal with the ruling government to provide the flash to every single citizen. On the first day of free flashes, the nation ground to a halt with long lines at every location. The government, for its part, had the expensive link-up vindicated by an immediate drop in crime rates, as citizens were no longer left at the mercy of emotions like rage and associated drives like vengeance. If Gillian had been born a few decades earlier than she was, she too would have had to endure the kind of sadness and heartache she'd read about in history books. If she had been born just a few years earlier than she was, on the other hand, she would have remembered the corporatist government's controversial decision to start limiting all emotional volatility, rather than simply ensuring a baseline of happiness. Although this decision was controversial, mandatory flashing ensured that no citizens questioned it in any serious way. This was because the decision was implemented as soon as it was made, and any neurological shifts towards confusion or even critical thought regarding the enhanced EV limitations were instantly neutralized by the system's targeted pulses. By then, the pulses had become far more subtle and refined than they were at first, to the extent that citizens usually didn't even know when their thoughts and feelings were being limited. Any feelings of suspicion or resentment about the system would be quelled before they could develop, quickly replaced by something warmer, and nothing would seem out of the ordinary. The limitations became more and more invasively restrictive over time, with the system now keeping citizens within a very narrow band of acceptable emotional volatility. Crime had been essentially eliminated, but at no small cost, for as well as a floor on sadness, Happy Inc. and its Clover technology now put a ceiling on happiness. Neurologists and government officials came to the conclusion that a drop from a happiness level of 10 to a happiness level of 5 could be more damaging than a drop from 5 to 4. The relative swings in emotion, the volatility, really was what everything came down to. Research repeatedly showed that the most emotionally stable citizens made for the most diligent workers and obedient societies, so stability came first. Emotional stability was now the order of the day, at the cost of true happiness itself. And so it went that every day of Gillian Reid's life had played out with neither wonderful surprises nor major disappointments. Indeed, any external events that would have once struck someone as even moderately nice surprises or minor disappointments failed to register on her greatly constrained emotional Richter scale. Despite the company's name, Happy Inc. had ushered in a world where comfort had not just defeated sadness, but had also eliminated happiness. With no meaningful relative changes in mood, no one ever had reason to feel any worse one day than the next, but nor did they have reason to feel better. Life existed only in the mediocre middle, a steady 5 out of 10 world where passion and invention were as absent as anger and jealousy. A colossal level of nationwide infrastructure was required to keep the system functioning in this way, but the technology Gillian had been trialing would put an end to all that. Soon, customers would no longer need monthly top-up flashes to keep their brains susceptible to the pulses. Soon, the pulse-transmitting and face-reading happy cams wouldn't need to be embedded within every surface of every public building, within every piece of privately owned furniture, and on the screen of every digital device in the country. Soon, the system wouldn't need to use the happy cams to judge a citizen's mood and deliver the appropriate pulse. As the criminal outside was taken away, kicking and screaming like the slave to emotion he was, Gillian finally turned away to exit the elevator. She caught sight of herself on the elevator's mirrored edging, very briefly feeling insecure about a skin imperfection on her nose that she was seeing for the first time. A well-timed pulse ensured that the negative feeling faded almost instantly. Gillian stared dumbly for a brief moment as her mind emptied. She then glanced to the reflection of her forehead, where the incredible Clover device was barely visible even as she looked for it. This contiguous limiter of volatile emotions, a tiny adhesive circular prototype of the new device that would eventually be implanted under each citizen's skin rather than stuck on top of it, negated the need for flashes, pulses, and happy cams altogether. Given its proximity to the brain and all of the cutting-edge technology within it, the Clover could read its owner's mind and deliver the right kind of pulse all on its own. Gillian Reid was one of very few trusted Happy Inc. employees currently equipped with a Clover dot, and for that she had been as momentarily grateful as its limitations would allow. She looked away from her dot and stepped out of the elevator, ready for another day at the office. But little did Gillian know that within the next few minutes, this Clover and its unique abilities would throw her headfirst into the day from hell, with implications more far-reaching than she could ever imagine. Chapter 3. "Gillian," a male voice called as she stepped out of the elevator. "Walk with me. You're just who I wanted to see." The voice belonged to Jose Bamford, head of analytics at Happy Inc. and the man directly above Gillian in the company's hierarchy. "I mean, of course I would rather be seeing you without all those clothes on. Maybe tonight?" "Maybe not," Gillian replied very flatly, looking directly at the womanizer who was well known to abuse his position of power whenever the chance arose. A wave of revulsion passed over her, hitting hard but briefly. It was gone as quickly as it arrived. Gillian followed Jose towards his large corner office without another word. The brief revulsion of a few moments earlier had given way to a neutral state of mind, but upon entering the office, Gillian felt something new for Jose: derision. This came about due to his request for her to stand on one side of the office while he walked to the other, evidently so that he could benefit from the sloping floor and appear considerably taller than he actually was. Like other Happy Inc. executives, Jose Bamford lived his life with a higher range of emotional volatility than ordinary citizens. In practice, this meant that the system had different intervention thresholds for these individuals than for everyone else, sometimes quite considerably so. Accepting this requirement was a sacrifice on the part of the bosses, they insisted, since it brought with it the burden of emotions that outweighed any creative or inventive benefits associated with the above-average freedom of thought and feeling. Whether that was true or not, it was perfectly clear that Jose found himself beholden to internal fluctuations of a kind Gillian didn't have to worry about, for while her discomfort at a skin imperfection had faded almost instantly, here Jose was with a sloping floor designed specifically to assuage his height-based insecurities. Even if she had been able to feel sorry for him for more than a fleeting instant, Gillian wouldn't have. In a world where Jose couldn't offend or upset anyone in any lasting way that might come back to hurt him, that lack of consequence paved the way for tendencies which in a previous era would have been considered as sociopathic. Jose was the furthest thing from a nice man, but Gillian's narrow band of emotional volatility meant that she generally held a similar kind of neutral indifference to him as she did for everyone else. "I saw the status of your workload," Jose said, switching to business mode after his earlier comments fell on less interested ears than he'd hoped. "I didn't think you'd finish it over the weekend, let alone on a Saturday. And then these suggestions you made since yesterday. You really came up with it all so fast?" Gillian nodded curtly. "I did. When they're implemented, these changes could further streamline the clover dot and bring even greater acuity of intervention." Jose scratched his chin in deep thought. "The ideas are excellent," Gillian stated without ego. "Nailing down the specifics kept me awake even when my eyes felt tired, because these changes simply had to be nailed down while the concept was fresh." At this, Jose's eyes widened. "That doesn't sound right." "Expand," Gillian said, toneless and somewhat robotically. Jose did. "Well, ideas shouldn't be keeping you awake. Someone like me, perhaps, but your EV range shouldn't allow for any fixations like that. Would you say you felt driven?" he asked, talking as he walked to the computer that was built into his standing desk. "Now that you mention it, perhaps I did," she replied. "I started and I had to finish. Is that how it feels to feel driven? Determined?" Tapping and typing frantically on his desk, Jose didn't look up. "It is, Gillian, and I fear that your prototype clover dot might be erroneously programmed to grant a level of EV that someone in your position shouldn't—" Very abruptly, Jose stopped speaking. He gulped. "Yes?" Gillian asked. She felt a pang of concern, but a pulse very quickly rid her of it before any real feelings could develop. At last, Jose met her eyes. "Gillian, I cannot apologize enough for this. For a 48-hour period from midnight on Friday to midnight on Sunday, it seems that a system error rendered your prototype clover dot completely non-functional. All weekend, you were at the mercy of your unrestrained emotions." "How interesting," she said. Jose narrowed his eyes. "Do you understand what I'm telling you here?" "I do, but perhaps this was for the best? I should raise it with Mr. Moyes. Thank you for sharing your discovery with me. Will that be all?" "No, it most certainly won't," Jose replied with more than a little urgency. "What do you mean about telling Mr. Moyes? And what do you mean about it being for the best? You could have developed UTS, unrestrained temperamentality syndrome, Gillian. That's no joke." Although spoken entirely without emotion and lacking in conviction just like everything else the emotionally constrained Gillian ever said, her next words rattled her more expressive boss to the core. "The evidence of my efficacy and the inventiveness of my extra work while emotionally unrestrained makes me think that the restraints might not be as universally beneficial as we thought. Perhaps we should reevaluate the system?"
"Reevaluate the system?"
Jose echoed in disbelief. He was very suddenly beginning to see the downside of turning people into emotionless robots. Thinking without feeling, they were at times unrestrained by social propriety and apt to step out of line.
"No, Gillian, listen to me. You can't tell anyone about this. We'll both be in trouble. Me for letting it happen, and you for not reporting it immediately. And no good will come of it. Do you want to get me in trouble? I don't think so."
"I feel no guilt for any consequences that might befall you, and no fear for any that might befall me," she replied. "We were both unaware, so there should be no problem in any case. Mr. Moyes will—"
"Mr. Moyes would fire us both,"
Jose snapped. In an act of desperation, he returned his focus to his desk computer and navigated to Gillian's consumer control dashboard.
"And for that reason, I can't risk it. Thinking about this is clearly doing nothing, so I need you to feel it. I'm going to briefly disable your clover dot for the duration of our conversation. Are you ready and willing for me to do that?"
A brief pang of fear hit Gillian, but left so quickly that it effectively failed to register in her mind. If you think it's the best course of action, the chain of command is clear. Jose gulped again, now feeling more than a little weirded out by just how robotic Gillian was being. He noticed only then that her EV limiting clover dot, which had malfunctioned in the direction of open emotions over the weekend, was now incorrectly operating at its maximum limitation setting. This meant Gillian's emotions and thoughts were functioning within the narrowest possible band, considerably more limited than even an average unskilled worker. Seeing no reason to share this latest discovery, Jose kept it to himself.
I do have to warn you that being emotionally unrestrained is going to feel very different when you know you're unrestrained, he said. It won't be like Saturday and Sunday. Just so you know.
Gillian nodded curtly. I understand, she said, about to be proven more wrong in this statement than she ever had been before. Just one moment later, and for the very first time in her life, Gillian Reid then found herself truly aware of her feelings and truly at the mercy of her own mind. Chapter 4. Gillian watched closely as Jose made several tapping gestures on the system control screen. The last of these gestures was the most important. The gesture that in one remarkable moment disabled her clover dot and left her entirely unprotected from her own emotional volatility. Happy Inc. had decisively defeated this scourge on humanity, and Jose had been reluctant to inflict it upon Gillian, but the ends justified the means. Gillian was a good worker, but any dissent against the company's services could be as dangerous for society as news of Jose's oversight regarding her clover dot could be for him. Like a child caught smoking and then forced by a parent to finish the whole pack, Gillian was about to get a necessary lesson in the foolishness of her ideas. With a single tap of Jose's finger, Gillian Reid's world changed in an instant. The next thing she noticed was his wedding ring. In light of his recent proposition and well-known history of infidelity, her emotionally open mind jumped straight to revulsion in considering the full picture for the first time. This feeling, the first firmly and lastingly negative one Gillian had ever experienced, almost took her breath away. She held a hand towards her own throat, gasping for air in anticipation of an airlessness that never came.
It's okay,
Jose said, seeing her discomfort and knowing from the stress tests while determining his own appropriate threshold for negative feelings that her reaction would quickly stabilize. Gillian's breathing returned to normal within a few seconds, but her ill feelings towards the man before her only grew. He had been awful to her for so long, both personally and professionally, and only now was her mind able to contextualize those memories for what they were and to react appropriately. You're the worst person I've ever met, she said. He laughed instinctively at this.
Welcome to the world of hormones and emotional reactivity, he smirked. It was always worse for women than men. Less inbuilt emotional control, I think. But you'll get used to it. By the time this 5-minute chat is over, you'll have been begging me to turn your EV back on for 4 of them.
Experiencing a complex flood of thoughts and feelings far beyond anything she could understand, much less describe, Gillian didn't reply. She instead walked to the window at the far side of Jose's office, up the sloped ramp that now made her shake her head in disgust at how pathetic and petty he really was. I saw a man get arrested this morning, she remembered, gazing out at the spot where it had all gone down.
So?
Jose asked.
I saw too, and heard. It was the most obvious case of UTS I've seen in a while. There's a celebration rally at the end of the day to mark the anniversary of the day Happy Inc. linked up with the government to usher in the peaceful world you're currently taking for granted. The man we saw was probably a saboteur.
Gillian turned back to him. I don't know. At the time, I think I felt sorry for him, but then a pulse must have made me forget. It wasn't a strong feeling. I remember now, though. I remember now that I have some emotional acuity. I still feel sorry for the guy, but not because he didn't have any clover protection. Now I feel sorry for him because of how rough the police were, how anguished he sounded, how downtrodden he looked.
All of which was because he didn't have any clover protection,
Jose insisted.
He looked like a deadbeat because he was one, and was a deadbeat because he was running around with a head full of emotions. He is what happens without our services. He is what you think you want to be.
Gillian said nothing, but felt a strong and unfamiliar resentment for the dismissive tone Jose was using.
In these few minutes you're going to have without any emotional limitations, he went on, there are some things I want you to consider. You know, to get rid of this silly idea that's infected your mind about life perhaps being better without EV limitations.
She held his eyes, the beady eyes she now recalled as both lecherous and condescending, from instances when she'd felt brief pangs of disdain upon noticing such things before her Clover's well-timed pulses sent her attention elsewhere.
Gillian, people used to get murdered, all because other people got angry. People used to have their belongings stolen, all because other people got greedy. Through the EV limitations the Clover system provides, our services ensure that citizens stay within carefully decided emotional bounds. No one gets angry or jealous, so no one gets murdered or robbed. Do you see?
But no one has the kind of creative ideas I had yesterday, she countered. I remember school books about explorers and inventors from the before times. Where are the inventors now?
Here,
Jose proclaimed.
In this building, in this room. Even you. Like you said, you came up with your ideas for streamlining the Clover Dots operation even further than it already has been. You did that despite your lack of EV, not because of it. So the point stands.
Gillian slowly rubbed the tiny device on her forehead. I don't think the point does stand, because I never had ideas like that when my EV was limited. When I was like everyone else, getting a flash every month and having the happy cams scan my face to decide which pulses to send me, I never had these ideas. When my Clover Dot was working for the first few weeks of the test, I never had these ideas. But this weekend, without the EV limitation, I was able to feel driven to succeed. I was able to feel passionate about my work. At the very least, maybe my permitted volatility range has been set too narrowly. What do you think? By way of an initial answer, Jose pointed to the wall to Gillian's left. This directed her vision to the huge aquarium beyond the glass. What about it? She asked.
Do you think that shark would be happier in the wild, where it would have to hunt for every meal?
Jose challenged.
Do you think it would prefer a life of uncertainty and the swings from satisfaction to desolation that came with it? Is the high of the catch worth the low of the hunger? Of course not. Gillian, we have defeated the swing. To question that is an affront to everyone who paved the way for the safe and comfortable world that our generation was fortunate enough to inherit.
Looking around Jose's office, sloped floor, shark tank and all, Gillian couldn't shake the distinct impression that he might have been overcompensating for something more than his height. Maybe the highs are worth the lows, she said. Maybe there's something to be said for the challenge of freedom over the safety of mediocre comfort. Jose, himself capable of feeling a wider range of emotions than almost anyone else besides Gillian in this present moment, felt his eyebrows lower.
You sound like an ingrate,
he snapped.
This is what UTS does. You're not yourself, Gillian. This was a bad idea. If anyone higher up hears you talking like this, you'll be fired on the spot. And as irritated as I am by your words, that's not something I want to see. You're a good worker. I'll re-limit your EV now so we can discuss this like adults. All I need to do is tap this—
No, she interrupted, hurrying to Jose's side. She took hold of his hand, preventing him from using the screen. Hear me out, will you? I feel stable, not like I did for the first few seconds. I want to give this more time. Why don't we see how much work I can get done today, completely unrestrained by my Clover Dot, and then talk about it. I won't go to Mr. Moya's unless you want to come with me. Jose blew air from his lips, struggling to believe what was happening and especially what he was hearing.
Emotions were a curse on our kind,
he hissed, quickly losing patience.
Your Clover Dot is the cure. Happy Inc. is the cure. A day of unrestrained emotions would be a horrible day, Gillian. Believe me, You don't want that.
But I just had that, she countered. My emotions were unrestrained at the weekend. I just didn't know it. So maybe the emotions themselves aren't the problem. Maybe the problem is that we expect emotions to be a problem. Maybe if I took this thing off my forehead and didn't get another Clover flash, I would work at this level every weekend. To Jose's ears, this was very dangerous talk. To his surprised horror, Gillian's open emotions were making her question her Clover dot, rather than reaffirming its value as he'd expected. And to Jose's mind, this was very dangerous talk that necessitated a very decisive lesson to silence it.
Fine, we'll give it a day,
he said, confident that she would come to regret it.
Tell no one, but we'll give it a day. Deal? If you still question the value of your Clover and the company's services after a full day without them, we'll talk to Mr. Moyes together, and I'll support your position.
Deal, Gillian replied with a determined nod. She glanced again at Jose's wedding ring and then back up to his ever-leering eyes. As Gillian left Jose's office for her own, where she would ironically be working diligently to ensure the speedy operation of the very systems of EV limitation she herself was currently living without and openly questioning, the shaken man stared at the control screen on his desk. Jose couldn't believe how Gillian had begun to think and talk when her Clover dot was disabled, and for the stability of the company and thus society itself, he felt like he couldn't risk the possibility of her sticking to this opinion come day's end. With this in mind, and feeling like the furthest thing from a corporate villain, Jose pulled up a more extensive profile on Gillian Reid. This wasn't a situation he would dare leave to chance, so Jose made the decision to spend the day actively monitoring her metrics and creating emotional challenges she was unaccustomed and experientially ill-equipped to handle without crumbling. Put simply, the newly determined Gillian Reid wanted to live this day free to experience the highs and lows of human emotions. And one way or another, Jose Bamford was going to make damn sure those lows were low enough that she would never have such foolish ideas again. Chapter 5. As morning gave way to noon, Gillian Reid felt a growing swell of determination and accomplishment like nothing she had ever known. A challenge had been laid down, and she had accepted it not only to prove herself correct that EV limitation might not be as unquestionably positive as everyone thought, but also to prove a point to a man she all of a sudden intensely disliked. For the first time in her life, Gillian wanted to do something for a reason beyond the practical. She didn't just want to show Jose she was right. She ached to show him that he was wrong. As Gillian's workday progressed with one standard task after another, a host of unfamiliar emotions danced and weaved their way through her mind in a manner that made her feel like she was pleasantly tipsy without any of the side effects. Quite simply, the simultaneous breadth and depth of feeling wasn't just like nothing she had ever known. It was like nothing she had ever imagined. Throughout her career at Happy Inc., and indeed the preceding high-achieving years she spent in education, Gillian had always wanted to do well without ever really feeling any burning desire to excel. This was entirely by design, with a key strategy in the government's decades-long commitment to ensuring equality of outcome being its approach to motivation management. Everything related to the systems administered by Happy Inc. on the government's behalf worked on a strict need-to-know basis, and a mid-level analyst like Gillian had no need to know that the system had for many years been using pulses to actively implant emotions when it deemed such an action beneficial. Everyone understood that the system limited things like sadness and anger. That was its core purpose, after all. But precious few had any clue that it also worked to implant emotions like satisfaction, and even the contrasting and supposedly negative feeling of dissatisfaction. If someone was struggling economically to the extent that continuing hardship might soon push them towards considering illegal actions, the system would increase their motivation to work. It would also do the best it could to improve their focus, but to this date, this could only be done via implanting feelings of disinterest in whatever normally distracted the individual in question, be that television or junk food. On the other hand, whenever individuals who were already doing well felt like striving for more, the system likewise kicked in to distract them with something else. An early change to Happy Inc.'s slogan reflected this kind of squeeze to the middle, when "you deserve to be happy" gave way to the more relative slogan of "you deserve to be as happy as everyone else." It quickly became clear to those in power that achieving full emotional equity, similarly to prior attempts to achieve full economic equity, was most easily done by cutting down the tallest poppies as well as trying to directly assist those struggling to thrive. The day when pulses were able to directly influence thoughts as well as feelings was considered the holy grail endgame of Happy Inc.'s ongoing mission. But until then, the desired effects could almost always be achieved through emotional manipulation. The number of employees who knew that the system's infrastructure operated on a multifaceted emotional mosaic that grew more complex by the day, rather than the horizontal happy-sad spectrum many believed to be in use, could be counted on two hands. Most of the time, and for almost all citizens all of the time, the system ran completely automatically. On occasion, some high-profile citizens had been targeted for political or commercial purposes, in a manner that saw high-ranking executives authorize so-called custom interventions. And to count the number of employees who even understood that custom interventions could be made, let alone that they had been, one hand would have been comfortably sufficient. Jose Bamford, Gillian's nemesis for the day, was one such clued-in individual. And as the afternoon wore on and the challenge he had laid down appeared to be going the wrong way, he decided it was time to step in. At any cost, the system had to be protected. Chapter 6. Shortly before 3 p.m., Gillian received a notification on her phone. She looked down and saw a status update regarding her ex-boyfriend Mitchell, informing her that he was now very happily and very suddenly entangled with her longtime best friend. A swell of sadness hit Gillian in that moment. Instinctively, she closed her eyes in anticipation of the gentle pulse that would take it all away. No pulse came. Gillian tried to center herself. This is the downside, she thought. Sadness like this is the price of being able to have thoughts like these and feel the happiness that came before. On considering this, flashes of memories entered Gillian's mind and evoked stronger positive feelings than she could remember experiencing, even while the pleasant moments were playing out in real time. This, in turn, brought another upsetting wave of realization that it was all in the past, and that Mitchell's future would play out with someone Gillian thought she could have trusted to never do such a thing. The spiraling vortex of emotions was almost too much to bear, until a glance at the clock showed Gillian that she had less than 2 more hours to get through. If the clock reached 5 p.m. without her admitting she couldn't handle life without the Clover's limitations on emotional volatility, she would win. Just as importantly, Jose would lose. Mitchell had never been like Jose and had regretted the end of their relationship as much as Gillian did, so her focus now returned squarely to the boss she was so determined to defeat. At 5 p.m., one way or another, all of this will be over, Gillian told herself. She was right, of course. Come 5 p.m., she would either have her EV limitations restored and thus be comfortably insulated from all negative emotions, or she would feel a rush of victory that was already bringing warm feelings of anticipation as she merely imagined it. Wait, she thought, I just regulated my own emotions. I contextualized the past and used the promise of the future to help me through a challenge in the present. My mind delivered its own pulses. For all intents and purposes, Gillian was once again correct. Without the need for any external interventions, her own rational thoughts had just assisted her fluctuating emotions. The freedom of thought and feeling that existed without an active Clover dot had enabled her human brain, far more dexterous and powerfully adaptable than any device any man had ever dreamed up to control it, to take care of things on its own terms. Through the remarkable experiences of this remarkable day, she was beginning to believe that at the very least, EV limitation should be pared down to protect people from only the most debilitating levels of desolation. Placing a true floor on emotions might not be a bad thing, she conceded to that end. But as for the massive limitations she was only now realizing had been in place for her whole life, to say the least, those no longer seemed justified. Gillian put her phone down. She smiled briefly at the happier memories of her time with Mitchell, all while reminding herself that her friend hadn't really done anything wrong. Stable marital or romantic unions were greatly advantageous to society as a whole, as thousands of years and dozens of civilizations could attest, so the system always ensured individuals could develop sufficient romantic feelings for one another to stay together, but without getting so far as anything complicated like love. The system was careful in assigning partners, effectively playing matchmaker by deciding which individuals were allowed to feel anything more than fleeting attractions for each other. Breakups were tremendously rare, boredom, lust, and resentment being so constrained as they were, but in some instances they were inevitable. Gillian's case was a perfect example, becoming necessary when Mitchell was assigned to a Happy Inc. office on the other side of the country. There had been a degree of temporary sadness, permitted by a system that was more precise and nuanced than almost anyone knew, but until today, Gillian hadn't thought about Mitchell for more than a few seconds at a time. Now free to think and feel more openly, she tried to recall whether she had ever tried to dwell on their time together only for a pulse to have sent her attention elsewhere. Did I want to remember him before today? She wondered. Despite her efforts, this wondering proved fruitless. She just couldn't be sure. This brought a new thought to mind, that it wasn't only odd for news of Mitchell's new relationship to show up today, it was flat-out suspicious. In a sloping office down the hallway, Jose Bamford sat, uneasily monitoring an impossibly complex array of data. Although Gillian's Clover Dot wasn't currently operating to control her emotions, it was still measuring them. Looking at her profile data on the screen, suspicion was not an emotion Jose had hoped to see. He was more than a little concerned to see such a high score for determination, too, but slightly heartened to see that sadness and jealousy had spiked. They were in decline, admittedly, but his intervention to spoof a relationship notification through the Happy Link social media app had worked. Gillian tried to hide her feelings, but they had been there. With both parts of this consideration in mind, and with the clock well and truly ticking, Jose decided that it was time to escalate. Acting entirely against the spirit of their challenge, and partially to ensure that Gillian wouldn't fully wise up to his indirect phone-based intervention, Jose navigated away from the data and back to the main control screen. From there, with several finger taps punctuated by bitter muttering about showing her who was boss, Jose reactivated Gillian's EV limitation. He set her maximum happiness level to 30 out of 100, from where he would gradually lower it to 5. The lowest possible ceiling, and one that had never even been tested, let alone used in anger. "You brought this on yourself," he grimly whispered to the profile picture of Gillian in the corner of his screen. "You brought this on yourself." Chapter 7. Oblivious to the targeted campaign of EV manipulation Jose Bamford was currently conducting against her, Gillian tried to focus on her work and push the challenge out of her mind. This was going fairly well until 4:45 p.m., when the increasingly desperate Jose abandoned his drip-by-drip approach of lowering Gillian's mood and slammed her happiness ceiling from 21 out of 100 all the way down to 5. Her phone beeped just after the change came into effect, announcing yet another notification. This one was for an incoming message from none other than Jose Bamford himself.
"How's it going?"
the message read.
"Wanna call it quits? I won't hold any of this against you."
She didn't react at first, not yet hit by a change that took several seconds to kick in precisely because it was such a major one. It first hit Gillian when she realized she had entered an incorrect data string in one cell of the spreadsheet she was working on. Normally, this would have evoked a groan and no more, but today she stared at the screen for several seconds before slamming her fist on the table.
"Stupid, stupid, stupid!"
she lamented at herself. A colleague from the office next door hurried through, alarmed by the sound of fist on desk and even more so by Gillian's highly uncharacteristic roar. "Is there a problem?" the man asked, somewhat robotically. He was as indifferent to Gillian's feelings as he would have been to anyone else's, hence the syntax of his question seeking information on a potential problem rather than asking if she herself was okay. At this point, though, he noticed the tears welling in Gillian's eyes. Rather than seek to soothe her, as an emotionally unrestrained human capable of experiencing meaningful sympathy or empathy probably would have, the man hurried to report the situation to his superior. "Something is wrong with Gillian," he began saying over and over again, as he walked slowly into the hallway and then all the way to Jose's office. When he arrived, he expanded. "Sir, something is wrong with Gillian. She has become visibly emotional." Through the open doorway, Jose could now hear Gillian wailing. He racked his head for options and quickly tapped a button on his screen to reset her clover dot to its default levels of EV limitation. It was now Jose's turn to curse himself, wishing he had retained some patience, or had at least dropped Gillian's happiness index to 10 out of 100 rather than the dangerously low level of 5 he had ultimately chosen. All he could hope now was that she wouldn't have been permanently damaged by her emotions being limited to a suicidally depressive level for this very brief period.
"She's trialing the dot,"
Jose said as calmly as he could.
"It may be malfunctioning. Thank you for bringing this to my attention."
Gillian's colleague, who had worked next door to her for 4 years, simply nodded and got back to work. He didn't check on her, so didn't see that she was still rocking with her head in her hands, striking the figure of a major trauma victim, even after Jose called off his rash intervention. Jose did check on Gillian, out of his own interests rather than any concern for her well-being.
"Well, you almost made it,"
he said when he arrived.
"I just had to return you to the default EV limitation level now because I'm going down to the anniversary rally that's about to kick off. The timing may have been for the better since you were becoming increasingly upset about something, which is understandable. After all, that is why we limit emotional volatility."
Gillian looked at Jose through uncertain eyes. She no longer felt inexplicably desolate, but the brief emotion had been tense enough to leave an echo in her mind, even after all the emergency pulses that had fired from her clover dot as soon as Jose set things back to normal. This, however, was now the only echo in her emotionally relimited mind. "I won," she said. "I didn't ask you to stop, and you called off the challenge because I was winning. And not just that. I won because I was determined. And look at my work. I finished everything early, again, even with no EV limitation for most of the day. I finished a whole bunch of extra work because I had no limitation, just like at the weekend." Jose gulped. With her EV limitations back in the normal and highly restricted middle range, Gillian most certainly should not have been talking like this. She was anything but the robotic woman he remembered from the morning and every other day. She sounded determined, defiant, and worst of all, independently minded. Because Gillian had felt such intense determination so recently and so strongly, conscious awareness of it still lingered in her mind. It echoed louder and longer than her memories of the brief pang of desolation, and the look on Jose's face suggested that he knew it.
"I think the reports I received from other workers concerned about your behavior tell us that you didn't win anything, Gillian," he retorted. "But I'm willing to put all this behind us. Are you?"
She didn't reply.
"You won't be telling Mr. Moyes about your silly thoughts from this morning, I presume, just as I won't be telling him about your disruptive actions a few moments ago. We'll put this all behind us, shall we?"
"I won't be telling Mr. Moyes anything," Gillian replied, faking the best robotic accent she could manage, and turning back to her work desk as though nothing had happened. With echoes of feelings she could never have imagined still rampant in her mind, she stood up as soon as Jose was gone and used the edge of her fingernail to prise the almost invisible clover dot from her forehead. "I won't be telling Mr. Moyes anything," she whispered to herself, making sure Jose had walked away from his office and then tiptoeing towards it. She stepped in, and looked down at the vast crowd gathered outside to celebrate Happy Inc. and all of the joyless mediocrity its breakthroughs had sentenced the world to all those years ago. I won't be telling him, because he's not the one who needs to hear it. Chapter 8. Completely unrestrained once more, Gillian's mind experienced a rapid influx of several returning emotions. Desolation was not one of them, which she expected was because it had struck so briefly, and chief among them was determination. Standing in Jose's sloping office, shark tank and all, brought back all kinds of memories from their conversation in the morning. She remembered everything she had said about the potential benefits of an emotionally unrestrained life, and she now believed it all even more than before. Suspicion was a feeling that wouldn't go away, and gazing down at the screen on Jose's desk told Gillian that she was right to have considered him a cheat. He was a cheat in more ways than one, very evidently, because a changelog of interventions made against her Clover Dot was staring her in the face. Most strikingly of all, she could see that the system gave its operators powers to control far more than just the key metric of a citizen's happiness. Everything was on the table, quite literally, and Gillian felt more than a little sick to see that Jose and his fellow executives had always been able to control her feelings in a far broader and more invasive manner than she had ever thought possible. And what a careless idiot, she thought, trying not to waste any time thinking about how foolish Jose had been to leave this on full display. She then considered that he would have had no reason to think anyone would ever look at his screen, given how strongly their own clovers would dissuade them from feeling any curiosity to do so. But what Jose hadn't factored in was that by giving Gillian's mind a taste of true emotional freedom, he had made it simply unwilling to be overpowered by the same pulses that would normally send its attention and feelings in any direction the system desired. She gazed at the shark once again, imagining what it would have done if it was suddenly dropped in the ocean. It certainly wouldn't stick within a few meters of Jose, she figured, unless it had a chance of biting his head off. It would swim away in an instant, exhibiting all of the power and following all of the instincts that had been restrained by the glass walls for so long. Free at last of her own glass walls, and looking through a huge window to the crowd below, Gillian had only one thing in mind. The crowd below, full of families and couples as well as excited individuals, brought something into her mind that the system had worked for her whole life to constrain. True selflessness. Another long-curtailed feeling, that of driven determination, was also back. This time it was directed to an even bigger goal than proving to Jose Bamford that Happy Inc.'s system of emotional limitations was perhaps not as wonderful as everyone assumed. Now, in the few moments she expected to have left before being apprehended for removing her Clover Dot, Gillian Reid wanted to prove something much bigger to a lot more people. Chapter 9. Making the most of an opportunity that would expire in a matter of moments and never return, Gillian utilized her unrestrained intellect and problem-solving skills to navigate through a few basic menus on Jose's control screen. She was astounded to see a menu for something marked Emergency Halt, and even more astounded to see what came next. Hardly believing the power that quite literally lay at her fingertips, Gillian found herself one tap away from instituting a halt on all EV limitation in the vicinity of the building. The message on the screen was stark. This last resort security option should be utilized only in the event of a hostile takeover of another control system when no other option to stop the hijacking is possible, and only for as little time as strictly necessary. This block will be irreversible by any other agent for 5 minutes, and you will be held personally accountable for any consequences of your decision to proceed. Do you wish to proceed? The decision made itself. Gillian tapped proceed. With that done, she had to get down to the ground as quickly as possible to explain what she had just done, the only chance she would ever have to say her piece to an audience who were atypically able to hear it. She passed several confused colleagues in the hallway on her way to the elevator, all of them asking each other in unusually animated voices if they too had just experienced a strange feeling. No one yet seemed to have clicked on to the fact that their clovers had been disabled. As with Gillian at the weekend, the change would be more noticeable when they knew it had been made, or thus that their emotions were free to run in every which direction. Nevertheless, Gillian continued forward in the direction of the elevator without speaking, since these were not the people she wanted to tell. Her priority was getting outside to address the huge crowd, and saying anything before she was past the building's security officers could have put this in jeopardy. Gillian smiled as she stepped into the elevator, delighting in her ability to develop a plan like this. It felt like she had a superpower, and the fact that it had been latent within her all along made her even more determined to tell people how totally their inner lives had been controlled. When she reached the ground floor, Gillian walked calmly to avoid raising any suspicion. She briefly reflected that security guards were probably allowed to feel higher levels of something like suspicion than regular members of the public, since the success of their job depended on it, and thinking about yet another way Happy Inc.'s executives had been able to play God for so long made her feel sick to the pit of the stomach. This wasn't a feeling she was particularly glad to be experiencing for the first time, but it further boosted the feeling of determination to succeed, a feeling that was becoming one of her favorites. As the cold air hit her face and her foot hit the concrete beyond the building's automatic doors, Gillian Reid took the deepest breath of her life. There was no going back now. Chapter 10. "The system is down!" Gillian yelled. A few people near her turned in response to the call. "The system is down," she repeated, moving further forward and keeping an eye out for police or security officers. This time, far more people heard Gillian, and their interested muttering brought a growing swell of attention her way. "Pay attention to everything around you and you'll see that I'm telling the truth. You're all unrestrained right now, but that's not a bad thing." Many of the crowd gasped, first at the words and then again at their growing realization that she was right. They were all feeling surprise and fears on levels they'd never known, and it was all down to her. "I had no limitations all weekend by accident," she went on, "and it was the best weekend I can remember. Then today, I found out just how much the executives in that building have been controlling us. Whatever the founders of Happy Inc. set out to do, it hardly even matters. The people who work here now, including me by association, have been working to keep us all in tiny emotional cages. They don't want us to feel because they don't want us to think. And they don't want us to think because this system doesn't stand up to rational thought." By now, Gillian had caught sight of several groups of security guards. "This is going to be over soon, but you won't forget these feelings quickly. Trust me on that. The same just happened to me. Before they silence me, I just want you all to hear that it's okay to be happy and it's okay to be sad. Whatever the system tells us, it's okay to be successful and strive for more. And it's okay to be below average and be happy there. The system has conditioned us to want what it wants us to want, but there's so much more to life than this. When we open ourselves up to joy, sorrow can sneak in. But what if it's worth it?" Gillian was running now, making sure she stayed free of the approaching security forces long enough to say her piece. "What if the highs are worth the lows, and what if the risks are worth the rewards?" she asked. "While you can, just look around at each other and see what you feel now that you didn't feel 5 minutes ago. Sure, you might see someone and feel anger or hatred towards them for something they did in the past, something the system has made you look past until now. Those feelings aren't nice, so notice them, but don't focus on them. Focus on what matters. The love you feel when you look at your children or your partner. What about that? What about the good and bad memories that are flooding into your minds right now, each making the other feel stronger because that is how it's meant to be? What about that?" Utter silence circled. "Their system will come back online in a few minutes unless we stop them. And if it's really so good, then making sure we can have a real discussion has to be okay, doesn't it? That's all I'm calling for. A discussion. A debate about why we're doing this and where it's all going. Because it's time to weigh up all the things we've been missing out on for the sake of comfortable mediocrity." 3 police officers, all feeling and thinking things they never had, were now standing in front of Gillian, just a few meters away. Her eyes flitted between theirs, and she sensed their uncertainty. "The challenge of freedom is a challenge worth accepting," she said, "because we weren't born to live in cages." A voice from the crowd spoke up, the first to do so. Its words were loud and clear to all in attendance. "Leave her alone!" Gillian's heart was warmed. Whatever came next, she had done all she could, and had gotten through to at least one person. Recognizing that she had told everyone she could about what was really going on, and raised a discussion about what other kind of life might be possible, Gillian felt a wave of pride flood over her. She had acted with bravery and conviction, perhaps with more than a little recklessness thrown in, and had no regrets about a single part of it. Now, as everyone in the crowd stood in amazement with no controlling pulses to tell them what to feel, for a few more minutes at least, the rest was up to them. The end. Thank you for listening to Happy Ink, written by Craig A. Falconer, narrated by Megan Carter. Text copyright 2020 by Craig Falconer. Production copyright 2022 by Craig Falconer. All rights reserved.